Finding the Christmas Spirit and Other Essays by Michael Lieber. Published by Larkwell Books. Read by James Brown. Finding the Christmas Spirit. A seasonal essay by Michael Lieber. Read by James Brown. All in the United Kingdom will know that change in weather, when October is running thin and the cold, dark mornings appear. And in truth, I am particularly fond of this time of year. It suits my style perfectly, and if it snows, then all the better. It is a time where I tend to get quite active, quite social, when Christmas is nearly upon us. Events will be attended, readings will be given, friends will be visited, pints of ale will be drunk, tobacco pipes will be peacefully puffed by the open fire, joyous laughter will ring out to the heavens. But, confessedly, there are some years where you find yourself utterly drained by December and lack sufficient zeal to conjure the Christmas spirit, or any spirit for that matter. When one is a child, that red and green wonder finds you so easily. But in adulthood, more often than not, one must seek it out. One must throw oneself into festivities, be sirened by Christmas songs. One must carol away that hardened lair and find the magic within. But as some will no doubt ask themselves, in the larger scheme of things, is it important that we search and find such a faded feeling within ourselves, the Christmas spirit? Well, I assert it is, because when you strip away the jolly red wrapping paper, what you are left with, in its simplest form, is a feeling of hope. Hope for a new year, to push on, to get up and start again, to try new things. Individually and collectively, a feeling of joy at Christmas time is vital. But where to find it? Or does one make it? Well, the first thing I do, as a rule, is go to the theatre, around mid to late November, early December. The theatre is your friend and will guide you true. I recommend seeing a pantomime, or failing that, a Christmas-themed ballet or play. You will be surrounded by others just like you, tired from a heavy year. Give yourself over to the collective laughter, the silent awe, the children yelling at the stage. And this point brings me quite neatly to a second source of Christmas wonder. Children. Children are a wonderful shortcut to finding the Christmas spirit, as I'm sure any parent will tell you. It is all new to them, and their excitement and joy is nothing less than infectious. Although it is worth stating, it is a rerouted feeling of cheer that ends up in the same place. Christmas is suddenly very important again, not to your individual self, but because it's important to someone you care about. But I would never refer to it as something akin to second-hand Christmas spirit, as it is, in some ways, more crucial than experiencing it firsthand, for you are now the guide of an early human's own Christmas spirit. But now what else can one say? What else stokes the chestnut fire within us? We've covered theatre, covered children. What about reading? And I must say, if you are engaging with an obscure festive essay such as this, an avid reader you must be. Well, I do have a recommendation for a Christmas read, and I am ambivalent to how embarrassed I should be to confess it, as it is undoubtedly a children's book. But it is also the children's book. I speak, of course, of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Mr. Lewis Carroll. It has become something of a ritual of mine. I read it almost every year around Christmas time, and my mid-length memory has grown so bad of late that the words read as new every time I pick it up. But why this book? It is not a Christmas book, true. But it does titillate the wonder part of our brain, where the Christmas spirit hails from. It is a book that, for the briefest of moments, finds that overgrown path back to childhood. The next piece of advice is quite materialistic, but buy an item of clothing in a festive colour that you would never otherwise buy and wear it in public. If you find yourself in front of a dressing room mirror thinking, this bright red jumper is not me, then you are on the right track. Buy it. Step outside yourself. It will jolt your numb nerves. And another reason why the Christmas spirit is important that has just occurred to me is that it aids the separation of time from one year to the next. And this is best for one's sanity. A time without time is a mad world indeed. And speaking of time, I'd best bring this short essay to a close, for it is getting late. I need to go to bed. We have just bought an electric blanket I am quite fond of. It goes under you, not over you, as a point of wisdom. But yes, important and true, feeling the Christmas spirit is vital. Never let a year end without embracing its carolling bells. Good night, dear ones. The Great British Sunday Roast, a cultural essay by Michael Lieber. Read by James Brown. I am compelled to put pen to paper to release such compliments that I bear within my being for one of the finest institutions we have here in England. I speak, of course, of the Great Sunday Roast. In this brief odish passage, I intend to praise this grand spectacle, without, and prepare yourself now, without even a drop of satire or hiding humour. I shall try my best. I am aware that to do so is not in keeping with neither my temperament nor 21st century literature, or 21st century anything for that matter. I am infected by the age. It has become common practice to scoff and snigger and ruthlessly satirize every notion of an honest sentiment. But witness me now, with shield and sword in all my blueness. A brave knight am I. I adore my Sunday roast. I adore it for a whole host of reasons. In an average working week, it is perfectly positioned in mid-Sunday, and beats the horrid approaching rise of a Monday morning with a full stomach and just a whisper of Christmas warmth every week of the year. A few slices of roasted beef, bathed in rich gravy, potatoes, carrots, peas, cauliflower and broccoli, with the saucy side options of mint, apple, horseradish and cranberry. And for due diligence, if needed, a fancy affair, then by all means add pigs in blankets and stuffing and perhaps a spot of crackling. This is the Sunday roast in all its glory. But in the same breath, I happily state it is a dish not afraid of outsiders, for it is secure and confident in its position. Chicken, lamb, pies, even brown sauce, red sauce, buttered biscuits, bacon, rubble disguised as meat. All are welcome on the plate. A Sunday roast will hold out its arms and greet those weary travellers in a jolly embrace, as a friend. Come in and know me better, man. And I will gesture to the Welsh for this wild flair, for they lead the charge in this regard. And behold, the Sunday roast with a twist was born. And for an added side note, it must be said, the best roast beef is, of course, Welsh beef. But admittedly, I must confess, the timing of a Sunday roast is not unique. There are many countries and cultures that consume a big meal on Sundays. But I stand astride with frantic limbs, dear reader, indeed at Speaker's Corner, and boom my bass baritone, the Great British Sunday Roast beats them all, for it transports all that savour its flavours to that English Eden. A simple, warm, Cotswoldian pleasure, that innocent, dewy countryside realm of Hardy, Dickens and Austen, lay-leafed and comforted. The friendly shade of a weeping willow in golden green summer as you rest by the riverbank. I fear I may be projecting by this point. So I will put forth a more universal crown, one of the defining features that is famed the world over. Hear the drum roll. The spotlight descends. Pull back the velvet curtain. Here it is, in all its puffy appeal. The Yorkshire pudding. And if you have opened your doors to the world, you will know that any foreigner that tries a Sunday roast for the first time, the Yorkshire pudding is undoubtedly the highlight. And with good cause, for it is the only element of a Sunday roast that has the power and volition to stand on its own as a main meal. In its first incarnation, it was a larger deity and went by the name of dripping pudding. It was first debuted in Sir Alexander Casey's cookbook, The Whole Duty of a Woman, in 1737, and then later improved and renamed by Hannah Glass's cookbook, The Art of Cookery Made Plain and Easy, in 1747. The Yorkshire pudding's fruitful history even predates the Sunday roast itself by a good 80 years or so, and fittingly, like the evolution of our fair kingdom, it shrank from its immense size to a more manageable structure, but regained its reputation and vigour. It joins the Sunday roast, a bona fide celebrity. The carrots ask for its autograph, the peas swoon and faint, and the roast potatoes act casual and pretend not to care, but their quick side glances give them away every time. And with all these unions in play, the Sunday roast is now internationally known. As I understand it, there was even a brief vogue in American history, in cities admittedly, where the Sunday roast was quite popular, due to the influence of Victorian Irish immigrants, but has since fallen from Yankee tables. Well, to any such foreign plates, I will of course sing its graces. Welcome the Sunday roast into your homes once again, and feel not a jot of regret. The Scottish, the Irish, and the Welsh are all part of the tradition naturally. I wonder if small numbers sit down to a Sunday roast in Australia. Surely they must, with the amount of British boffins gliding themselves over there on a daily basis. Influence, tradition, and indeed repetition are very powerful things after all. And since the aforementioned retraction of the British Empire, it brings me quiet pleasure to think that in past Britannia lands, such as Canada, India, and Africa, in some deep, dark corner of their society, perhaps the sound of horseradish sauce being spoon-clinked onto the side of a plate can still be heard to this day. They certainly do in the far-off British territory of the Falkland Islands. But as I understand it, they see the consumption of a Sunday roast as purely medicinal. They scoff down the gravied beef in order to ward off the fear that they may wake up one morning and find themselves Argentinian. A terrifying prospect, I'm sure you will agree. And now let me think, yes, why not? Let us roll out the red carpet once more for another key player, Madame Gravy, a merit badge well deserved. The gravy is the blanket of community that brings all together as one. But just like the Yorkshire pudding, gravy has a history of its own, and not all good. Let us never forget the tragic tale of Molly Maru, the Scottish hotel owner credited for creating the best gravy that had ever been tasted. People would travel hundreds of miles to her small village of Pittenweem, whereupon they would board her lodgings and savour her famous roast dinner with that astonishing gravy. Soon enough, word quickly spread across the country, and before Molly Maru knew it, there were lines of people queuing outside her humble hotel every day of the week. At first she was delighted, and welcomed as many in as she could. But the pressure of cooking that many roast dinners became impossible, and she resorted to simply handing out polystyrene cups of her gravy at £2 each. But this only seemed to draw even bigger crowds. It became all too much for Molly Maru, and in an effort to unentice the hordes of people, she could think of nothing else but to raise the price per cup. But this in turn only created buzz, intrigue, a media storm. News stations turned up, helicopters hovered outside. All roads that led to Pittenweem were traffic jammed all the way to Belay Bridge and back again. As Molly Maru desperately raised her prices again and again and again. At its peak, a Norwegian prince bought a medium-sized barrel of her best gravy for the hefty sum of 13 million kroner, close to 1 million British pounds. And in another account, a gravy-addicted mother drowned her newborn in the Pittenweem harbour to sell its tiny clothes for just a thimble of that ambrosia gravy. Before long, the crowds were no longer content with merely tasting the gravy. They wanted to know how it was made. What ingredients did it possess that made it so impossibly delicious? And Molly Maru, on numerous occasions, could be seen shouting from an open window to the packed gatherings below. "Never! It's a family secret, and she'll never leave my lips. Now away, all of you, be gone! You're driving me mad!" And alas, after months of disturbed sleep, gathered faces tapping at her windows, begging for more, pleading to know, Molly Maru finally rang her bell and ran out onto the crowded street in only her nightie and lightly flung herself off the Pittenweem pier and landed fatally onto the hard deck of a fishing boat, killing her instantly. After this awful tragedy, the peaceful town of Pittenweem was never the same again, and indeed the world cried a single tear that day. Not just for poor Molly Maru, but for the recipe that was now lost forever. And so, to commemorate her memory, the gravy boat was invented and graces our tables every Sunday. It stands as a reminder that we may indulge ourselves in good gravy, but it is never the best gravy. Now, let us conclude with the last note left to play. It is impossible to write in any great detail about the Great British Sunday Roast without at least gesturing towards the religious ties that brought about its creation. Christianity is its mother, and the Sunday church service its heart. But alas, a heart that ticks but once a year. I am aware of the strength of Christian communities, but for many in the United Kingdom, Sunday is no longer a day of piety. It still remains a day of rest, but this does not include a lengthy church service. And I will also quickly add that I have no intention of qualifying whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. It is simply self-evident. I consult the poll taker in this matter. However, the Sunday roast, in my opinion, has taken on a new and glorious responsibility. It plays a pivotal role in our national identity. It stands with many other notable traditions, the full English breakfast, acknowledging the weather, tea and biscuits, and the dream of a comfy retirement in the countryside. It is in good company. Company that we all agree upon, for the most part. But who gets the prize, I wonder? Who is responsible for making the first plate? Who gets the credit? Well, it is the Irish, and fully deserved. They invented its template. The roast beef, the potatoes, and the farm-reared vegetables. I shake your proud hand, my mighty green cousins. But as the rolling rock will roll, the story had only just begun. England added their best, and indeed the Welsh and the Scottish added their best. It is a dish that we all share and all helped create and recreate every Sunday of the year. May it grace our tables forever. It is our united pleasure, our kingdom's dish. Bow, bow, wait for applause. No applause. Curtain closes. Off to the pub. Lieber on Shakespeare, addressing his doubted authorship. A satirical essay on Shakespeare by Michael Lieber. Read by James Brown. Welcome. Adieu. Sit down, those that remain. Thank you all for coming. Indeed, it is a pleasure to see you all here today. My dear Stratfordians and Oxfordians, and Baconians and Marlovians and Twainians, and supposers and surmisers and doubters and troglodytes and people who couldn't care less and are only in attendance for the free food. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I do believe it is the first time in history that you have all been in the same room together, and I do serve myself with sufficient grace to take full credit for that. Now there, Baconians, I will have none of that here. Here at this grand symposium. No, I don't care that the Stratfordians threw a shoe. Enough is enough. Get yourselves settled, for the matter is at hand. A resolution, if you will, concerning the doubted authorship of one William Shakespeare. We'll stay here all night if we have to, and as I'm already behind the podium, I suppose I should start us off. Did an ill-educated, untravelled Midland man really write all those wonderful plays? Works of genius? I may as well state my allegiance from the start. I believe he did. Collectively, the symposium gasps in horror as the period actors Mark Rylance and Derek Jacobi approach the podium. Stop, Mr. Lieber, before you make a fool of yourself, declares Rylance. We have here a document, the Declaration of Reasonable Doubt, no less. It currently holds over 3,000 signatures of people with higher degrees, declaring their skepticism for the man of Stratford. Yes, Mark Twain's signature alone should be enough to convince you, adds Jacobi, brandishing a pen. Sign it, Mr. Lieber, and be done with this nonsense. But I have indeed consulted Mr. Mark Twain, and although I found his critical essay, Is Shakespeare Dead?, an enjoyable piece, I'm afraid I am still not convinced. Sorry, Sam. The symposium falls once again into disarray. The preeminent writer Mark Twain stands up near the back, throws his cigar on the ground, and storms out. What is more, the Oxfordians spit on the Stratfordians, the Baconians take off their trousers and toss them hard and rude at the Marlovians, and the supposers and surmisers simply sit back and enjoy the fiasco. Calm, my friends, calm. Listen to me. I urge you to listen to me. I know your logic, your doubts, and it is indeed justified, and I agree with you. All does not add up when it comes to dear William. There is a piece missing. The Sphinx is noseless. I too have surmised that the wealth of knowledge possessed by the plays does not equate my fellow Midland man's experience. I agree with you, I do. But understand me now, that your very reasons for believing he didn't write his plays are my reasons for believing he did. And perhaps for the uninitiated, we should list the 4 main marks against dear William's name that inspires such doubt in so many. First, we have the plays themselves, that deliver a detailed knowledge in a variety of subjects of which he could have known nothing about, given his education, status, and lack of travel. These include descriptions of battles and foreign lands, logistics of law and falconry, and the inner workings of the royal court. Secondly is the multiple spellings of his name, which crop up no less than 80 different times throughout his life. Thirdly is his legal will, that suspiciously does not bequeath any books, parchments, or playwright papers of any kind. And lastly, for a finishing fourth, the enduring belief that dear old William was in fact completely illiterate all along, given that most of his family were. So without furtherness, let us begin with the first. Supposing his life before London really was as dull as people surmise, how could a man with 0 miles travelled and no higher education possess the gigantic, unobtainable cathedral of knowledge held by the plays? You say dear William couldn't, and I agree with you. But in the same breath I will also state that there is scarcely any one person suitable that could possess that level of first-hand knowledge and life experience, leaving the likes of all of you grasping in the dark for some impossible scholar. It could not and will not be any normal man. It has to be, it must be someone truly divine, verging on deitization itself. And as I see it, there lies the inherent snobbery that overlooks the obvious. For it is in our nature to make a big mystery out of a hat man's riddle. Take the case of Jack the Ripper, for example. Because of the unanswered question that hovers over his or her head, humanity's imagination has run rampant, envisioning the uncaught killer to be a lauded politician or a famous writer, or even a duke or a prince, when in cold reality, it was most likely the first unassuming man who reported the first body, a complete nobody, an individual not worth a second thought. But as we all know, the power of a nobody is that they can be anybody. And the same applies to this colourful question. Your politicians and earls will not do when one follows the first man to the first word. It is simply dear William, poor William, determined William, the supreme autodidact. And the more he succeeds in winning over the masses, the more the scholars hate him for it. For he is, truly, an outsider. Yes, indeed, it's Willie all the way, and the richness of experience emanating from the plays supports this fact. You see, to me, it seems all too much. There are too many obscure references, of which mean almost nothing to the groundlings watching the plays, and they're certainly not integral to the stories in which they appear. They seem forced, placed on purpose in an effort to impress someone. There is too much. It is overcompensating. He has overcompensated. Like a working-class lad in a new office job, spending 3 months' wages on an expensive watch and designer suit in order to fool his manor-born colleagues that he is, in fact, one of them. It is well documented that many well-educated, well-travelled and well-to-do figures of the time were disparaging of dear William. Who is this upstart crow? This uneducated dunce of an actor who suddenly thinks he can write plays? A small mob of snobs, which had all incidentally either seen battle, were involved in law, or likewise royal dealings. Now, given William's lack of education and experience, being sniggered at by all the high-benched intellectuals, I can imagine him feeling the need to, and yes, I will say it again, overcompensate in his work, gathering and pouring as much life and trivia into his plays as possible. I can see him in a poorly lit pub taking dictation, writing down every word that dribbled from an old sailor's sunburnt mouth. I can see him seeking out letters written by real lawyers and then filtering them through his poetic pen onto the page, in the hopes that Ben Jonson, sitting amongst the audience, may hear it and think to himself, perhaps this Shakespeare isn't the oaf I previously thought. Perhaps he is worth knowing after all. I can see Ben Jonson, and others like him, presuming, as you have all presumed, that if the knowledge is in the writing, then it must be a reflection of the writer's own expertise and intellect. And therefore I put it before you that the Bard of Avon, William Shakespeare, rather than being the all-knowing, omniscient writer, was in fact the great assembler. All factions, upon hearing this, rage and spit towards the podium, but inevitably lack sufficient trajectory. The front row suffers the blow. Now, although half of you have already left the symposium, I will continue on to the second allegation. The many spellings of his name, Shakespeare, Shakespeare, and others. And if you wish, I will also address the bad handwriting, as I know you so want me to. Admittedly, I find this point the weakest of them all. Writers have always sought to revise and improve their signatures. It is a matter of vanity that it looks handsome on the page, that it commands respect. And drawing from my previous reasoning, if Shakespeare were a more common spelling of the rarer and more prestigious Shakespeare, then it seems perfectly plain to me that he would tweak the spelling. Many writers have done this. Why, I myself will confess to it. For my own God-given surname was a noble, but very laboured Welsh handle, with about 7 F's nesting in the middle. And in my own earliest years as a London playwright and actor, I spelt this tag in all manner of ways in an effort to improve it, before the great relief of having someone change my surname entirely. She was a dark German mare, with chestnut brown hair and irises as dark as marbles. One of the greatest loves I have ever known, who would begin her perfume letters to me, Mein lieber Michael. Oh, my dearest brown-eyed Fräulein, whatever became of you? Where was I? What was I saying? My thread waves loose in the wind. Yes, William's name, being spelt differently. Well, for additional reasoning that is cunning in nature, I would draw your attention to the number in question. His name is spelt differently, not 10 times, not 20 times, but 80. There is no accident nor coincidence in 80. Methinks the Sphinx has cut off its own nose. It stinks of intention. But I digress. Digress to the matter of dear William's atrocious handwriting, which is almost as bad as my own, and indeed any and all intelligent doctors and physicians up and down this sceptred isle. I reiterate again, my warring scholars, the point is weak and weary to stand. It will not stand. And now for the third allegation, the matter of his legal will, which simply is not that of a writer's. And I agree with you on this point, this peculiar point. Something is strange here. Something is amiss. You see, for any determined writer, a will is very important. Not just for the bequeathing of books and papers, but for giving one the opportunity to explain what is to be done and where things are to go. Why, even now, at the time of this penning, and a reasonably young writer in my mid-30s, I find myself surrounded by solicitors and lawyers tinkering away at my own will, mostly because of my stubborn request that the majority of my work fall into the public domain at the time of my death, a matter that perplexes the lawman to no end. But if my first presumption is correct, that Shakespeare is indeed the great assembler, then of course there wouldn't be any papers or books to bequeath, as the majority would be other people's dictations, notes, eyewitness accounts, all of which were thrown by his own fair hand into the fire, I should imagine, as he neared the end of his life, in order to leave no trace of reference, no proof to the equation, leaving only one assumption left, that Shakespeare is all of it. And if this presumption will stand, it shows that not only is dear William the great assembler, but also that he wrote the bulk of his plays alone, with no collaborators in sight. And lastly, the biggest stain of them all, that the great William Shakespeare couldn't write a single word. How could a small, illiterate child rise to become the greatest writer the world has ever known? Again, I use myself, not as a point of egotism, but as a point of proof. No one was dragged from the depths of illiteracy quite like I was. It stands, my friends, it stands, that a small illiterate boy from the Midlands can rise to become a great man of letters. In fact, there are so many plain parallels between me and dear William that to doubt his capacity for literary greatness is to doubt my own. And bearing that in mind, Mark Rylance, Derek Jacobi, I will not be signing your declaration of reasonable doubt. In fact, I suggest you ram that ink pen so far up your backsides that the nearest clerk could use your tongues as a blotting pad. I'll see myself out. The symposium erupts into a full-blown riot. The Stratfordians charge into the Oxfordians. The Baconians and Marlovians go fist to fist, and the screaming Twainians fail to flee as glass bottles and old books are thrown back and forth. Was anything resolved? My goodness, no. Have I contributed anything of value? Almost certainly not. In fact, I'm fairly certain I have left the matter even worse than when I found it. The Heart of Britannia, a narrative essay by Michael Lieber. Read by James Brown. I write this passage candidly, 1,300 feet above the earth, for I am travelling in style today, although where I do not know, by a hot air balloon. It is a splendid summer day in England, green and glorious. The air is sweet, the rolling countryside vast in every direction, the growing River Thames meandering its way to a distant blip. Hello, London, you handsome hive. Oddly, I do not feel anxious. I've never been a big fan of heights, but there is something about the sheer distance of being this high up that makes it seem like an illusion. It doesn't look real to the eye, but more importantly, I feel inspired to write. Nothing specific comes to mind, but the spark is there. Something will come to me soon. I can feel I am on the cusp of something, as if all my work had been leading up to this moment. But to what? What is it? Of late I have felt so very lost, with my head in the clouds, off with the fairies. But perhaps I should start with the series of events that led to me being in this precarious basket. Writing away in a pocket notebook next to a strange little man that I barely know, who insists I call him Captain. It all began in a tiny, dark pub in dear old Lichfield, of all places. The Earl of Lichfield. I always find myself drawn in there for a quick drink whenever I am in Lichfield, for it has an old-fashioned charm that I appreciate, a dimly lit, cosy quality seldom found in modern pubs. When I am there, I tend to acquire my pint and then sit alone in a quiet corner. Some know who I am and point from a distance. Some don't. Some are acquainted with me and will come over and talk. On this occasion, the charismatic acquaintance that claimed the chair opposite me was by far one of my favourites. He was a short, balding man, I'd say in his mid-60s, newly retired. He spoke very quickly and was obsessed with all things aviation. He knew all the names of the Red Arrows, past and present, off by heart, could drone about Spitfires and Messerschmitts for hours and hours, attended aerospace conventions and air festivals, and had acquired, in his retirement, his very own hot air balloon, and obtained a license to fly it. This, as he saw it, gave him divine right to proudly work into every conversation that he was a certified aeronaut. I never found out what his actual job was prior to retirement, but, at a guess, I would say a rather mundane but well-paying office job that had not the slightest thing to do with aviation. I've never had much interest in this particular subject, but when he spoke of his passion, his joy of flight was infectious. He had a lick of the poet about him. I would say I met this man a total of 11 times over a span of 5 years, and this is long enough in pub years for greetings to become crystallized. He would approach with his whiskey, sit down and say something like, "Hello, Mike," or Mick, or Mickey, or some other malformed version of my name, and then say, "How's the book business?" I in turn would say, "It's going very well. How's the balloon?" His response to this was always, "Living the dream. I'll take you up with me sometime." Now, this was an offer neither of us really took seriously. It was a pleasantry, and one I would never usually consider. As previously stated, one is prone to vertigo. But on this occasion, I was in a particular state of mind. I felt restless, and had just told a lie. The writing was not going very well. I hadn't written anything in almost a year, and any and all inspiration eluded me. I needed a kick, a jolt, something to fear, something to worry about, to overcome. So as our conversation ran its course, or rather I listened to him talk and talk about Pinewood biplanes of World War I and a few low-voiced trivia facts about Adolf Hitler, I waited patiently for the balloon to come up again, as it were. I didn't have to wait long. "Speaking as a qualified aeronaut," he said, taking a gulp of his whiskey, "they should bring back the airship industry for transporting freights. Twice as cost-effective as cargo ships, and you can land anywhere. That's why I went for a balloon instead of a plane. The accessibility." This was my moment. "Speaking of your balloon," I explained my dry well of inspiration, and that such an excursion would invigorate my pen hand. I then inquired when he was planning his next flight. He went oddly quiet and took another very slow sip from his whiskey. There was a feeling in the air that I had overstepped a boundary, that I had shattered the shallow pleasure of engaging with a casual acquaintance by asking for something more, something real, something tangible, something that required commitment. I could practically see the leaping of his brain as he ran through all of our encounters to ascertain how well he knew me. "Not quite well enough." He leant forward, pensively, and took to discouraging. "Well, the balloon isn't here in Lichfield. It's in Rickmansworth, miles away, where my son lives. He's got a truck. You need a truck for loading and pickup." Oh, how I think back on this moment. I should have just given a casual wave of my hand. "Oh, never mind then. I'll get the next round. Same again, bells and tonic." But I persisted, didn't I? Stupid, Michael. Stupid, stupid, stupid. Every chance he gave me to relinquish, I battled back in a wave of optimism. "Well, I can get to Rickmansworth, no problem. When are you next going down?" "Well, next weekend, but you'll have to put a good £500 towards the cost of the flight. It's not cheap, you know. There is petrol for the truck, fuel for the burner." "Not a problem. Saturday or Sunday?" "Well, I suppose Saturday. But I wear a special hat when I fly. You'll have to call me Captain." I saluted. "Aye, aye, Captain." I am aware I'm not coming across very well here, but the worst of me is yet to come. He did eventually settle upon my proposed adventure, and even got quite excited about it after half an hour or so, and spoke of the views I would see, and he would teach me about warm and cold weather conditions. But even as we parted ways at the end of the night, with our dates set and phone numbers exchanged, it still took a good few attempts to convince him that I was being deadly serious. Now, you will notice that I have not yet mentioned his name, and nor do I intend to. The reason why will become evident by the end of this essay, but for the sake of addressing him, he will henceforth be referred to as the Captain. It has also just occurred to me that I best not mention what year all this occurred in. Again, all will become evident. I should like to shorten, or rather squeeze, the details of the commute for efficiency if nothing else. On the day, got a handful of trains to Rickmansworth, 2 missed calls from the captain, 1 phone call with the captain, directions included, and 1 taxi ride to a field. And my timing could not have been more perfect, for the awkward handsy job of filling the balloon with hot air as it blubbers on its side had already been completed, and its gigantic size was magnificent. Oh, how I wish I could describe it to you, what it looked like, its colours, its shape and accessories, but its identifying features must remain a secret. Again, all will become evident by the end of this story. But I suppose, as I can't describe to you what the balloon actually looked like, there is no harm in making a description up. Its humongous bulb was gold and royal blue, with Grecian patterns and spirals, and crowned around its middle, with draping plumes of red satin. I know it may be lackluster to hear a fictionalized account of the balloon, but I assure you, the description I have just given doesn't even come close to how glorious this balloon actually was. It must have cost him a small fortune to have it custom made. The captain was already in the basket, fiddling with the burner, and to my amusement, he wasn't joking. He did actually have a type of captain's hat, like a mariner's cap, or like an old-timey train driver's cap, like the type Buster Keaton wore in that old movie, The General. I met the son, complete with truck, a very large, well-rounded, jolly type of soul. His arms were covered in tattoos. He seemed to know an awful lot about me. The father had built me up in his head, I think. Such imagined pedestals are not to be reached by anyone. As soon as I got into the basket, it was immediately clear that the captain's flying temperament was not the same as the whiskey-gulping man I knew from the Earl of Lichfield. He was sharp, technical, and professional. Good. I'm glad of it. It makes me feel safer. We're going up 2,000, possibly 2,500 feet. We'll be in the air for approximately 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll come down in another field to the north, on the outskirts of London. The son's job was essentially to drive after the balloon and pick us up wherever we landed. There seemed to be multiple gadgets and trackers and walkie-talkies on the go to help with this endeavour. I took a deep breath, the son got into his truck, the burner was turned up, and we were off. For the first few minutes, I had my eyes firmly closed and my nervous fingernails firmly embedded in one of the foam-sheathed crossbeams that holds the basket to the burner as the grassy field was pushed away from us, revealing itself to be just one green square among many. The son's voice staticked through the captain's walkie-talkie. "Pulling out the field now." I opened my eyes. The illusion was complete. And we are now, more or less, back to where the story started. But the setting is worth mentioning more than once. It was a splendid summer day. The River Thames revealed its full serpenthood before us, and I had not forgotten my reason for being there in the first place: to be inspired. 45 minutes to an hour is not really enough time to write anything substantial, leaving only short form to be achieved. And even this proved difficult, as the captain took it upon himself to act the good host and talked for a good while. Some of his facts about the history of ballooning seemed quite interesting and somewhat inspiring. But when he began to complain about new balloon flight restrictions and overly safe legislations put in place by the BBAC, British Balloon and Airship Club, this, I must confess, titillated about as much inspiration as a wet teaspoon. But naturally, as a diligent Englishman, I nod and aha and oh really. Meanwhile, I'm scribbling anything I can in my notebook as fiercely as the wind is ruffling my beard. A thought, a quotation, anything, just so I've at least written something. A man who wants to be strong will always have the last word, but a man who is strong will... I can't think of an ending. I was distracted, but still enjoying myself all the same. The captain continued to talk for a further 10 minutes, making 15 in total. But then, to my immense relief, he suddenly went deadly quiet. And it was such a sudden halt of speech that I took cause to look at him. He was frowning intently at one of his gizmos. "Anything wrong with the balloon?" I said. No, it's all fine," he replied sharply. I took this to mean all was above board and went back to admiring the view and the beauty of London off in the distance, which curiously seemed a lot closer than a moment ago, although the plan was to skirt the outer edges of London, so I didn't pay it much mind. I returned to my now quiet musings. So many little thoughts. Perhaps I shouldn't pander to the academics anymore. At least, not so much. Perhaps I should write a children's book, the type that can be told again and again and again, and achieve real significance to a long line of generations. It is not the first time I have had such a notion. It usually lasts about 3 weeks to a month and then turns on me, revealing itself to be a terrible idea. But I look at Dickens, I look at Twain, I look at Carroll, Barrie, and Anderson. It puts me in a sort of kind-eyed, Disneyland, Alice and Pan type of mood. And in that short time, before the turn, it seems perfectly possible to me. But of course the biggest concern one has with a fairy tale is not that it will fall into obscurity, but rather that it will reach such popularity that it will leave you behind. Why, only the other day I was in a service station on the way to Tenby, South Wales, to visit my mother. There was a table display with children's books for sale, among them a simplified edition of Treasure Island. I picked it up and flicked all the way through it, and not once, not even in small print, could I find the name of its original creator, Robert Louis Stevenson. The story was out of copyright, re-illustrated, rewritten, and repackaged for the masses. The story had surpassed its author. But I suppose the story still having enough relevance to be retold is at least something. My concentration was interrupted again, this time by the son's voice breaking up terribly as it crackled out of the walkie-talkie and said something like, "What's it saying?" I turned to look at the captain again, who now had an expression of both worry and anger. 12 knots, 14 miles per hour, said the captain. "Is that bad?" said I. "You'll have to go higher," said the son. "I am," said the captain. "Just tell me what's going on," said I. The captain took a deep, irritated breath. "We're having some unexpected wind shear. It's pushing us further east than we want to go, and so we need to go higher." It was then that I realized where we actually were. We were no longer sailing over green fields on the outskirts of London. We were now technically in London, and all abundant nature had been replaced with a sea of rooftops and busy roads. The balloon was going slowly higher, but not as steadily as we were moving west, and with every borough we passed, the captain became ever more troubled. The sun had now gone silent. He was either completely out of range or was concentrating on tracking our whereabouts, because after 10 minutes of undisturbed drifting, our fate became crystal clear. Not only had our direction completely changed, but we were going to be swept right over the centre of London. As someone who doesn't know the first thing about flying a balloon, the question I wanted quickly answered was, "Are we in danger? Is this bad for the balloon? Is this unsafe? Put simply, are we going to die, Captain?" But as he had to tell me numerous times, this was not the problem. Just to add perspective to our growing predicament, hot air ballooning over central London, at this time, had been strictly prohibited because of concerns of terrorism. Our situation was not only potentially dangerous, but it was also punishable by a hefty fine. As the worried captain turned on his phone and set about Googling with limited signal exactly how much the hefty fine would be, I took the opportunity to appreciate where we were. The view was indeed a rare one. Just as an aside, the use of a mobile phone in a hot air balloon, as I would find out years later, was also strictly forbidden. The whole escapade was becoming very messy indeed. But my, was it a sight! We had finally arrived. Hello, Big Ben. Hello, Tower Bridge. Hello, London Eye. And in that moment, something irresistible came over me, a feeling of supreme imperiousness. I stretched out wide my Icarus arms as my beard and blue scarf ruffled about me, the words of Ozymandias echoing in my ears. I'm ashamed to admit it, but it's true. I couldn't help myself. It was truly intoxicating. But perhaps I should explain. You see, the last and final time I lived in London from the time of this event was a few years prior. I had left in terrible circumstances. My love for the London stage had dwindled awfully low. I was disillusioned, penniless, and heartbroken, practically running back to the Midlands with my tail between my legs. And I suppose, all things considered, descending upon the entire city in a gigantic, garish hot air balloon with arms of Christ could possibly qualify as a magnificent return. At the very least, it was one hell of an entrance. But just as I was enjoying the warm glow of 1 million sets of eyes looking up at me as we floated over the Thames, the captain's quiet spell finally broke. As he proceeded to swear repeatedly and gasp at his phone, I presumed he had now discovered how much the fine would be for any balloon pilot caught flying over central London. "What does it say?" I asked, taken aback by his sudden rage. "That's ridiculous. I'm not paying that. I can't pay that," he said, more to himself than to me. And, in his agitated state, he put the burner on full blast and turned our slow, safe ascent upwards into a fast, hair-raising climb to the clouds. In that moment I became aggressive towards him. I was scared. I had no idea what was happening. But looking back in retrospect, I presume the captain's logic was either to evade being spotted, reported, and subsequently fined by hiding in cloud cover, or to reach such a height that it wouldn't technically qualify as being over a city. I never found out how much the fine was, but I imagine it must have been an obscene amount to make the captain suddenly drop all aspects of safety and professionalism. I must have said many things in that moment that made him even more distressed. The higher we went, the more we turned on each other, until the captain and I proceeded to engage in what can only be described as a full-blown screaming match, as the temperature changed from mild to noticeably freezing. The conversation went much like this. I have, of course, removed all of the profanity and replaced the incoherent crossovers with an adequate translation. "I say, Captain, land this balloon sharpish. You are going to put us in a sticky situation." "Don't tell me how to conduct myself. This is your fault, Mr. Lieber. You asked to come." "That is indeed true, but I do not control the wind, my good captain." And on this went, and only when I, hand on heart, promised to sign a legal document that I would take full responsibility for any financial fine that befell him did he begin to calm down. I better address this as an aside also. I did not sign any such document. Not that it would have stood up in any court of law, even if I had. But he was at least calm. Angry, irritated, but calm. We were now more or less clear of the city. The boroughs and small towns of outer London were now below us again. We didn't speak or even look at each other as we drifted downwards. I think he may have told me begrudgingly to hold on tight to one of the padded beams as we touched down in a field. It was quite a smooth and steady landing, I remember. It was about the only thing that was smooth on the entire venture. Now, my first impulse, as we both left the basket, was to physically attack the captain in some fashion for putting me in so much danger, but as we exchanged a passing glance, it was clear that he was struggling with the same impulse for potentially costing him a great sum of money. In the end, we settled upon a sort of tired cross relief. The son was called, who sounded even more relieved than we were. He was half an hour away. That was a very long and awkward 30 minutes of waiting. But eventually that lovely vehicle came into view. The balloon was deflated, bundled up like a sleeping bag, loaded with the basket onto the truck, and we set off. The son tried to lighten the mood, but eventually he went as quiet as we were. They dropped me off at the nearest station and drove away, and I never saw the captain or his son ever again. I would have expected to have bumped into him by now, with the amount of times I've been back to Lichfield and frequented that same pub. But I never have, and because I have had no contact with the captain, I never found out if anything came of the fine. But if it did come to nothing, I presume that amazing balloon, not so much the basket and burner, but the envelope, the balloon itself, was never flown again, for fear of incriminating the poor captain. And if it does still exist, it is most likely rotting in a garage somewhere. If this is so, it is a true waste of beauty, and only those who looked up on that lost London day will know how truly remarkable it really was. It's sad the captain didn't name it. All beautiful things should have a name, and for the few precious times it graced the sky, I shall name it now, and may it be remembered for that day. The Heart of Britannia. Allow me to make 2 points perfectly clear before we begin. First, an apology for the indecent amount of detail in this retelling, but seeing as the punchline is the loss and destruction of people's homes and businesses, I think it warrants a detailed effort on my part, that I at least try to remember as much as I can. Point 2. None of my actions over the course of this story should ever be considered heroic or brave. For, if I had not been so gravely intoxicated, I certainly wouldn't have endangered myself the way that I did, nor those that chose to stand beside me, and at the risk of sounding romantic in memory, I was young, all of 22. My hair was raven black, my eyes were blue lagoons. I had moved from Middle England to Collier's Wood in South London to secure work as a playwright and actor, and had rented a shoebox-sized room above an estate agent at £3.50 a month, just like Shakespeare, I used to say. My, was I living low. Most of my dwindling funds went on rent, leading my diet down a steady road of cheap microwavable pies and pot noodles. Now, in truth, I did not need to survive on such a meagre meal every night, but saved money meant more cigarettes, alcohol, and tube trains to rehearsals, as was my routine at the time. And now, in my age of blue, I look back on these vagabond years with amazement that I was ever happy. But I was, for I was in London, and would have happily slept in a puddle for the stage. But I digress with vigour, back to the riots of which lasted a total of 5 days, and it is worth mentioning that for the first 2 days I wasn't in London. I was visiting family in Lichfield. The riots were all over the news. Images of red double-decker buses smouldering on fire, and violent gangs confronting shielded lines of police. It was Friday morning, the 8th of August, and my intention was to return to London on the earliest train, an appointment I kept to my family's dismay, who insisted I stay a few more days until the troubles were over. But one terrible trait that prevailed in my youth was that of rebellion. If I was told to do something with any authoritarian tone, then it was imperative that I did the opposite. And so, back to London I went. I arrived at Euston Station at around midday, and tubed south to Collier's Wood, back to my shoebox. There was an atmosphere brewing, for the worst of the riots didn't happen during the day. They manifested at night, like a nightmare. Now, in my rented room, a sad sight to be sure, a mattress on the floor, a dusty microwave in the corner, an old bookcase overflowing with various scripts and scribblings, the complete works of Oscar Wilde, the complete works of William Shakespeare, likewise Samuel Beckett, Harold Pinter, and a smattering of Joe Orton, for good measure. I was eager to keep up with the news reports, as you can imagine. I had a television hooked up to a DVD player, but its screen did not receive transmissions from the outer world, for I couldn't afford a TV license. Correction, I didn't want to pay for a TV license. I did, however, obtain a pocket FM radio for my day's journey. The overall agreement amongst the static-filled channels was that no rioting would occur tonight, due to the weather forecast with its prediction of torrential rain. This came together with a strong assurance from BBC Radio 1 that the rioting had now stopped entirely. The police had prevailed, there would be no more troubles, only peace in London town. The culprits caught and made an example of, quashed, done and done. Now, in truth, as I lit one sovereign cigarette by the open window, I was quite disappointed that the excitement was over. The time was now 2 p.m. I ate a ham and cheese toastie, smoked a second cigarette, watched half a movie, and fell asleep on my mattress. I was sirened awake a few hours later by the sound of a fire engine going past the window. Or maybe it was a police car. I have never been able to tell their sirens apart. I thought nothing of it. Hearing a siren in South London was an everyday occurrence. But when a second, third, and even fourth siren screamed past the window, my lulling eyes snapped open, accompanied with a growing smile. My inner monologue began chattering away in a wave of adrenaline. It's happening, it's kicking off, the fires are coming, the troubles are coming. I quickly got dressed, whirled on my grubby long coat, stuffed the pockets with tobacco and money, and left my shoebox with a mixture of excitement, fear, and thrill for adventure. It was still light at this hour. At the end of the street was a flashing disco of fire engines and police cars. An old lady passed by me, clutching her handbag, eager to get home. For with age comes wisdom, and with youth comes curiosity. Being on the receiving end of youth, I sauntered like a curious cat down the street, towards the growing smokestack that was rising from the sirens. At the end of the street, to the right, was a car park featuring a row of large shop fronts, including PC World, Benson's for Beds, and the brightest star of them all, Mothercare. A respected, trustworthy brand for all parenting needs. A one-stop shop for prams, dummies, nappies, baby grows, powdered milk, and its newest admission, an exploded petrol bomb. The entrance doorway was a barricade of high flames, black smoke finding its way through the roof, and the great vapouring arcs of water from the desperate fire engines made the air almost tropical. I stood for a good while with a handful of other curious onlookers. "It's disgraceful. They all need shooting," said a very old man. "Why mother-care? Just why?" said a young woman. To our relief, the fire was extinguished just as it began flirting with Benson's for beds. There was no optimism in regards to further troubles. We all knew this was merely the starter before the main meal, the warm-up act, a warning shot. Get home and stay home was the message. I overheard a grey-haired man on his Nokia mobile urging someone, I presume his daughter or son, to come over and stay with him. He finished his conversation with the ominous words, "It's not safe to be alone tonight," which I myself was. The time was now 6 p.m, and it was starting to get dark. I lit another cigarette, thinking what to do next. Following the rule of safety in numbers, I carried on down the street to the Collier's Wood tube station. Opposite was my faithful boozer, the Royal Standard, a small, intimate pub where old salt-of-the-earth locals spent their hard-earned money, pint for pint, while reading the newspaper. I shuffled through the door and declared sanctuary at the bar, ordering 2 pints of Worthington's Bitter, 1 shot of tequila, and a packet of pork scratchings. I felt safe. There was a good number of burly, gold-ring bulldog types knocking around, one of which had brought a cricket bat that was slumped in one of the chairs. There were about 15 people in the Royal Standard that night, and almost everyone was quiet and watching the widescreen TV. The volume had been turned up for the news, which, in this darkening hour, had turned very serious. The fires had already begun in East London and were gradually migrating south, and Collier's Wood was mentioned on a list of potential problem areas. The reporters had quite a good idea of where the looting would flare up, as much of the meeting points were organised over BlackBerry Messenger, which had now been infiltrated by the police. The next few hours were admittedly quite a joyous time. As the wine and beer flowed, merriment followed. We made fun of the track-suited hoodlums that were being montaged on the TV. We spoke of Britain. Some acted tough. Others, like myself, turned to humour. We played ironic music on the jukebox. Sex on Fire by Kings of Leon. We Didn't Start the Fire by Billy Joel. And I Predict a Riot by the Kaiser Chiefs. It was now night. The streetlights had flickered on, and, as if summoned like moths to a flame, we began to see a small handful of hooded figures running past the pub window. I recall vividly one carrying a metre-length block of wood, and thinking how impractical it was. There were a few customers still sitting outside having a smoke. This dismayed the pub landlord, a little Irish man with a white moustache, whose name escapes me. Wait. No, his name was John. I think it was John. He was concerned about a great many things, but one matter he was particularly vocal about was that of litigiousness, that someone would be attacked or injured while sitting outside, and then sue the Royal Standard. He managed to coax them back in by making promises that quickly spread around the bar. "Right, until this shite is over, you can all smoke inside, because I'm locking the door." The bulldog types did not like the notion of an enforced lock-in and stood up to leave. The little landlord pranced around them, begging them to stay. None of us wanted them to leave. They were our protection. Everyone else in the pub was either a pretty young barmaid, an OAP, a passed-out alcoholic, or me, who was happily lighting a fresh sovereign with a puff-puff at the bar. I had never smoked inside a pub before. Eventually, the landlord resorted to yet another bold promise, as even more hooded figures sprinted past the window. "Right, the news has confirmed the looters are coming this way. They're heading to the Tandem Centre," which was a shopping complex 250 yards away. "So, it's safer that everybody just stays here for a few hours. Until then, it's a free bar. Is everyone happy to stay?" The bulldog's eyebrows went up collectively as they sat back down and started ordering the most expensive things they could think of. I myself took the opportunity to sample all the odd alcohols I'd never tried before. I tried brandy. I tried port. I tried champagne. We laughed and joked. Another cigarette. I remember being kissed by one of the barmaids for some reason. I was getting drunk. Too drunk for what was about to happen. As promised, we began to hear a storm of voices coming closer and closer down the street towards the Royal Standard. The only comparison that came to mind at the time was that of football supporters heading en masse to the ground of their rivals. In a scrambled effort to look inconspicuous, the little landlord quickly turned off all the lights in the pub. We sat in the dark, all staring out the bay window as the noise grew louder. I got told off for trying to relight my cigarette. "They'll see the flame, you fool!" One of the barmaids stood behind me. hugging me around the waist and placing her chin heavily on my shoulder. And then they appeared. Over 100 individuals mobbed their way past the window. The first thing that was evident was how young they all were. Some were as young as 14. They were kids, almost all dressed in hooded tracksuits. Some were wearing Halloween masks. Only a small number were carrying weapons. They didn't seem to be much interested in causing destruction as they power-walked down the road. Heading to the tandem centre was clearly at the forefront of their mind, and, as abruptly as they appeared, they vanished from view, although their raucous voices lingered in the distance for a good while. When a sense of safety settled on the street, the lights were turned back on in the pub, the doors were unlocked, and people were allowed to leave, of which the majority did very quickly. The mood was one of relief, with many hugs. Good night and good luck. Get home safe. The landlord and the barmaids began closing up. The chairs were turned upside down onto the tables. The rubber bar mats were removed and placed in the washer, next the collecting of glasses. I helped wipe down the surfaces. Besides myself, by this point, there were only 3 other customers. 2 old men in their mid-70s, who were talking very loudly about World War II, and a man in his early 50s, who was passed out on the bar, and had missed a great deal of the night's festivities. I remember he had shoulder-length blonde hair that I was amazed to learn was not a wig. Then, something happened that smashed all feelings of peace into 1,000 pieces. The bay window was not through, framing the worst of the worst. 2 Indian lads with black beards and 1 white man with a shaved head pulled up on push-bikes outside Collier's Wood tube station. The station was closed with a railing gate over the entrance. They stood leaning on their bikes for a good while, talking and looking around. Then they all moved away from the station door. The skinhead ruffled through a backpack, and then pulled out a green glass bottle with a sparkler duct taped to its neck. He lit the sparkler and hurled the bottle at the station entrance. Smash! The gate and pavement were engulfed in flames. They laughed, barked like dogs, high-fived each other, and then leaned on their bikes again by a bench. We all watched them with grave severity as they began pointing at various areas. A car wash stand, the corner shop, the Royal Standard, and then, to our immense relief, they cycled off up the street. It was clear that these creatures were not the same as the mob that had passed previously. Their intentions were different. They were not here to loot. They were here to cause chaos. "Right, we're out. Everyone out," said John the landlord, who was worried almost to tears. The pub was all that he had, his only means of support. The barmaids left first and walked very quickly, arm in arm, in the opposite direction to the tandem centre, while the rest of us clambered out to the tune of a locking key. John was now legitimately crying. He took one last look at the Royal Standard, bid the 4 of us good night, and set off after the barmaids. The blonde-haired man stumbled to sit down and slumped drunk onto one of the pub picnic tables. The 2 old men began walking away as they continued to talk about the war, throwing out phrases like "broken Britain" and others that are far too racist to be repeated. "Where are you going?" I said, climbing onto one of the wooden tables. "Home," they said sharply. "They might be back," I continued. "They'll burn it down. This is your local, your pub. We need to protect it. We need to stay. We need to guard it." No doubt it was the drink talking. The 2 old men looked at each other. "No, that would be stupid, lad," said the one on the left. Now, this part is somewhat paraphrased, but I said something to the effect of, "Hang on, you 2 have been ranting about the war for hours, going on and on about bravery and being honourable. Well, this is your chance to actually stand for those principles. If you leave now, you are no better than they are, and a traitor to your country." Essentially, I guilted these 2 grizzled pensioners into staying. I look back and regret this action severely, but my desired outcome was achieved. Here were 3 men to help me protect the Royal Standard from being set ablaze. Admittedly, we were not the most intimidating of protection, but at least it was something. We sat down and waited. More talk of the war, more talk of England. And then the worst thing of all happened. I ran out of cigarettes, and the only other smoker in the group was passed out. I woke him up to discover he too had also run dry. I'm embarrassed to say it, but my drunken young self started checking all the ashtrays for any surviving soldiers. Bingo! A small half-smoked cigar. I stuck its gungy end in my mouth and soon discovered that cigar smoke is not meant to be inhaled. The time was now midnight. We had waited for a good hour. There were no sirens to be heard, no police cars, no fire engines, No ambulances, nothing. We felt alone in our supposed bravery. Then, suddenly, without warning, to our utter dread, our bravery was needed. The bikes were back. The skinhead was chanting something I couldn't understand. The air was suddenly filled with smoke drifting from the direction they had just come from. They stopped over on the road where they were before and began talking and pointing again. We looked at them. They looked at us. It wasn't good. And then, to turn the matter into an absolute catastrophe, one of the old men yelled at them to go away in very colourful language. Stupid, stupid old man. One of the Indian lads already had another green bottle ready. It looked like it was their last one. They started to come over, their physicality very much on edge and twitchy. They weren't interested in arguing with us. They just asked us to move as they licked their lips, looking around for police. We then proceeded to call them every bad name under the moon in an effort to stop them. They had a sort of blank look in their eyes that was void of all reason. It was as if they couldn't even hear us. I said something like, "We are not moving, and you'll be done for murder if you throw that at us." I remember feeling a great disdain for the police in that moment. Where the hell were they? The blonde-haired alcoholic then began waving his arms about, and moved off to the left in a slurring panic. "Wait! Let me get out of the way! Don't throw it yet! I'm getting out of the way!" As the sparkler was lit, the two old men lost hope as they likewise shuffled out of the way. It seemed inevitable, but then, just as I was stupidly contemplating trying to catch the bottle in mid-air, something happened that turned the whole dreadful situation on its head. The torrential rain we were promised finally came, sprinkling at first, and then drenching within minutes. And my, was it torrential. I had only experienced rain like it in the tropics. I then said something like, "You can throw it, but the rain is just going to put it out." And then you wasted it. One of the Indian lads then tried to put the sparkler out with his hand and cried out in pain. Realizing there was now no safe way of lighting the petrol bomb, the skinhead took the bottle, stood in the middle of the road, and chucked it high up into the rain-ridden air. It came down with a smash and splattered petrol all over the road. They then just looked around for a while, looking bored. At one point they asked us if we had anything to drink. They were definitely on some sort of drug. They just slinked around like they had lost their purpose in life. And there we all were, getting soaked to the bone. Eventually, the troublemakers left on their bikes. Then, after a brief acknowledgement of what just happened, the two old men left also. One was staying at the other one's flat. Finally, the blonde man also left. Then, I was alone. I remember being alone, with my back against the pub, my hair dark and dripping in the rain. And then, as suddenly as before, it stopped, like someone had turned off a tap. Now, although I am agnostic at best, even I have to admit, the timing of that rainfall was eerily perfect. The time was now 1 a.m. My leather shoes were full of water and squelched when I began to walk back up the street to my shoebox. To say I was tired would be an understatement. I was utterly spent, and thinking fondly of my bed. Now, halfway between the Royal Standard and my flat, the road was cordoned off by a line of traffic cones, as well as by a lone police officer, completely on his own, just standing there by the cones. He stopped me as I passed with a sharp authoritarian tone. "Where are you heading, sir?" "To my flat just up there," I said, pointing forward. As his walkie-talkie came alive with static-filled voices, he spoke again, even sharper. "Right, sir, I want you to go straight home. Do not go to the Tandem Centre." "I wasn't going to the Tandem Centre," I said, with my head down, walking on. He was clearly there to stop any latecomers who wanted to partake in the looting. After 100 yards or so up the street, I finally reached my door and put the key in the lock. I was back. I was safe, and then inevitably, the possession of youth, the fear of missing out, the chance to bear witness, to see what others are afraid to see. I have to see it. I will see it. I took the key out of the lock, put it in my pocket, and turned back onto the street. I knew for a fact that just before the police officer and his many cones, there was a thin, dark path by the supermarket that led in the direction of the Tandem Centre. I crossed the road and snuck down it as quickly as I could. When I got close, the raucous sound of security alarms going off was finally paired with a hellish landscape. Just to reiterate what the Tandem Centre looked like, it was a shopping complex with a massive car park hugging a semicircle of large brand-name stores. There were well over 200 hoodlums running around, some in goblin masks. No police in sight. They had broken into many storefronts, but the two that had been looted the most were the ones that aligned themselves with young appetites. JD, a sporting goods retailer, and Game, a video game store. Droves of anonymous figures casually walked in and out with their arms spilling over with whatever they could get their hands on. Tens of thousands of pounds worth of brand new inventory littered the ground wherever you stepped. Some of the items I remember seeing were as follows. No less than 12 cracked plasma TVs, Prada, Gucci, Adidas, and Nike clothing, mostly shoes and hoodies, a dozen high-end watches, diamond-encrusted jewelry, the latest video game discs and consoles, a flat-pack children's trampoline, a cardboard cutout of a PlayStation character, a red toaster, a rubber mask of Queen Elizabeth II, a shopping cart full of Apple headphones, and a boxed Canon SLR camera that I knew for a fact cost over £3,000, just lying there in the gutter. Now, the way I saw it was this. It was fine that I was there and watching the chaos unfold. I was merely an observer. But if I touched any of the grounded goods that lay all about me, then I was no longer a simple witness. I would then be, in effect, part of the looting. As long as I kept my hands to myself, I was free of all crime and punishment. I found a nice observing point, the pavement adjacent to the Tandem Centre between two small trees. My blue-eyed view was that of pure bedlam, but one observation I made at the time was simply this, that I had never before or since seen the disaffected youth so happy. They were in a state of euphoria. Every day they had been told by their parents that they were useless, that they were poor, that they couldn't afford the newest Nike shoes, the latest video games. And now, on this night, it was all free. Whatever they wanted, whatever they dreamed of having, it was all for the taking. During my time standing there, I saw a great many things. Some sights were almost comedic, and even verged on the absurd. The first was that of a white mobility van pulling up and letting down the wheelchair access at the back, as the driver's mates waddled their way out of a smoke-filled Argos and piled the van with 6 large televisions. The doors were then closed, and the van took off into the night. Another sight that comes to mind was that of an enraged drunk father who turned up on a pink girl's bicycle with a basket on the front. He stumbled off and started yelling his son's name as he sought for him amidst the smoke. I can't remember the son's name, so we will just call him Alex. Alex! Alex! Where are you? Alex! When I find you, you're dead. I concluded that his son had snuck out to join in the mayhem. It is worth mentioning that I was not on my own between the 2 small trees on the pavement. I was approached by 2 Russian men who shared in my curiosity. They gave me a cigarette and a can of cheap Red Stripe beer to drink. One of them was very talkative and said things like, "Is this good riot? In Russia we have better riot. This not good riot." This was a very worthy point. I myself would not consider any of what I saw that night as rioting. These people were not standing up for some great cause. It was just an illegal shopping spree. That is not to say that real rioting did not happen during the London riots, but as far as Collier's Wood was concerned, it was mostly confined to looting and arson, which brings me once again back to the police. Where the hell were they? The lone police officer with his line of cones was a clear indication that they knew the Tandem Centre was riddled with delinquents burning the place to the ground, and yet they weren't anywhere to be seen. This remained an infuriating question for a good long while, but when I slinked off down a side street to relieve myself up against a wall, this question was immediately answered. As I stood there with my member in one hand and a can of Red Stripe beer in the other, I realised I was being watched from a distance by 50 police officers in riot gear. They were all in a close huddled line. They were protecting the petrol station down the street. After panicking out of view, I finished up, and then, with the last of my drunken courage, started walking towards them. If it sounds surreal, I promise you it felt surreal. I said to all of them in a fairly meek voice, "They're looting the Tandem Centre. They've set fire to it. You need to stop them. Why aren't you stopping them?" I was then taken to one side by a female police officer who explained the situation to me. I remember she was quite fat and brash with her words. "Look, they can loot all they want. They can set fire to the stores. The companies are all insured. It's bad,
But if one of those bombs hits this petrol station, it will become a far worse situation. All these buildings here are residential. Now, I suggest you go home, sir. Alas, I did. Slow and tired, I sauntered home. Key in the lock, head on the mattress. The night was over for me. And so my memory of the London riots of 2011 comes to a close. There were flare-ups over the next 2 days outside of London, in Birmingham and Manchester and a few other places. They called them envy riots. But they were quashed almost instantly. Then, it was all over. The newspapers, of course, had an absolute field day. Talk of race, talk of class division, talk of unrest. But overwhelmingly, the angle that got the most coverage was that of insurance. A lot of big English high street brands were in danger of going bankrupt at the time of the riots due to the increased popularity of online shopping. So when it was revealed that the two biggest names on this death list were no longer going down because of the gigantic insurance payout they received due to the fires and looting, a conspiracy theory prevailed that the riots had been arranged on purpose, with eye-catching news headlines like, "The London riots saves Sports Direct and Game," with the added logic that these stores just happen to sell exactly what young hoodlums want: expensive sportswear and video games. Now, I suppose seeing as this is an eyewitness account, I should give my own opinion or viewpoint based on what I saw. However, the truth is that I don't really have anything to add. I can only comment on my own individual actions of that night. And I think back with judgment and even a hint of embarrassment at my younger self, as we all do in time. But amongst this disdain lies a grain of respect that I played my part in defending the Royal Standard pub from being burnt to the ground, which, at the time of this penning, still stands to this day. And for that, I am proud.